Okay, so hello, welcome to my channel. Thank you for being a subscriber and or viewer, or just if you just stumbled into the woods and found me. Hello, I am Stephanie Breen, and I like to talk about random stuff. It could be anything: popcorn, porcupines, swimming pools, beefcakes, whatever pops into my head. Today we're talking about B movies and blockbusters. So, as the title suggests, the question I'm asking is, when did B movies become blockbusters? Because any student of cinema, like myself, I studied film in college, will tell you, because you'll know, that the first, quote, blockbusters were just B movies that were successful. They weren't supposed to be successful. They were not created or marketed to be successful. They just happened to be successful, and we're talking about Jaws and Star Wars. We already know the story about Star Wars. We already know the story about Jaws, but we got to back it up a little bit. We're going to bounce around back and forth. Because the first thing we have to do is clear one thing up. B movie is not a fucking letter grade. I know you Gen Z and younger think that there are A movies and B movies and F movies. No. No, there's not. That is not what B movie means. It is not a qualifier of quality. At all. At all. And it never, ever was. B movie never, ever, ever meant bad movie. That's not what the B stands for. Okay? A B movie goes all the way back to the 40s and 50s during the Hollywood system, when the studios owned the theaters. They would send out movies in blocks. You had the newsreel, you had the cartoon, you had the short, you had the serial, and then you had the main feature, the feature presentation, the movie you bought the ticket to see, and then after the feature presentation, you had the B movie. What it refers to is, again, young people don't know this, but there's video or audio cassettes. They have what's known as the A side and the B side. I'm miming because I don't have an actual physical cassette. There's one behind me, but I can't reach it. It's out of reach. But basically, that's what the B stands for. The B side. It's the same thing with your vinyl records. There's the A side and the B side. Now, your films were the same thing. Your feature presentation was the A-list movie. That's where the A-list comes from. This was your movie that people were expected to see. Easy Rider, Gone with the Wind, The Wizard of Oz, etc., etc. These were your feature presentations, your A-list movies. The B movie was the matinee, the double feature, the second half of a double feature matinee. It was the movie that kids stayed to watch after the mom and dad went home, and they left the kids with a bucket of popcorn and, a couple of nickels to buy a hot dog for lunch. Because you could do that back in the 40s and 50s, and you didn't have to worry about kidnappers and school shooters. So, like I said, the way it worked is you would buy a ticket for the whole day. You'd watch the newsreel, and then you would watch a cartoon, usually, depending on the studio. If it was Disney, it would be a Mickey Mouse cartoon. If it was MGM, it would be a Tom and Jerry cartoon. If it was Warner Brothers, it would be a Looney Tunes cartoon, whatever. And then, again, whichever studio owned whichever short would play a short. Our Gang, Three Stooges, Abbott and Costello, something like that. Blondie and Dagwood, some kind of comedy short, and then they would play the serial, which would be like your Buck Rogers or your the other one, I forget his name. The one that's not Buck Rogers. I always forget his name. And then, or something like, your Zorro or whatever. And then the A movie, and then the B movie. The A movie would be your movie. Like I said, Lawrence of Arabia or the Ten Commandments. This would be your movie, your feature presentation. The B movie would be The Blob, Frankenstein, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, The Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, The Day the Earth Stood Still, etc. Planet of the Apes, although I don't know about Planet of the Apes. That one might have been a feature, but that one comes across as B movie to me. But we're getting into the late 60s where we're starting to see the shift. Now, what happened? So, audiences back in the day, B movies were movies that studios made that were the low budget, basically the special effects movies. Or, in other words, genre films. Because for the first 50 years of Hollywood, there were no genres. They were just movies. We, modern audiences today, retroactively apply genres like mystery, or film noir, or drama, comedy, action, adventure, musical, etc. But that's not how filmgoers in the 40s and 50s saw their movies. They were just movies. They didn't have a word for sci-fi movies because there wasn't a word for it. There wasn't a word for special effects movies or fantasy movies or caveat, when I say fantasy, I'm referring to swords and sorcery, Lord of the Rings, Conan the Barbarian, that kind of stuff. Because to Hollywood, the word fantasy means anything unrealistic. The one where A-list actor, what's his face, Jimmy something or other, has an imaginary invisible bunny following him the whole movie. To Hollywood standards, that's a fantasy movie. To me, fantasy is like Willow or Legend. But to Hollywood, Mary Poppins is fantasy. Because they use the word fantasy as a synonym for fairy tale, essentially. Or basically, any movie that had unrealistic elements, be it supernatural or sci-fi. This is the reason why a lot of your old movies from that period, modern streaming services will classify what we would today call a sci-fi movie as a fantasy movie and vice versa, because sci-fi / fantasy, those terms were interchangeable. They meant the same thing. Basically, it was a catch-all phrase for anything that had non-realistic elements in it. So your genre films, your westerns, your what we would call action-adventure films, your sci-fi films, your horror films, etc. These were your B movies. Now in the 30s, when Hollywood was still relatively new, although it was 40 years old, you got to remember, the 30s, Hollywood was already 40 years old. There had already been 4 decades of Hollywood by the time the 30s rolled around. People forget that. Hollywood is older than you think. It didn't start in the 50s, like some people think. By the time the 30s rolled around, Hollywood studios were, for the first time, heavily investing in special effects. This is when you saw movies like King Kong, The Wizard of Oz, the previously mentioned Universal monster films, Dracula, Frankenstein, etc. This was, to Hollywood's standards, a fad. They were more interested in, quote, storytelling. They were more interested in what we would call epics or dramas. That's what Hollywood was interested in. Which is why a lot of these movies from the 30s and 40s, outside of like a handful of exceptions, are really hard to classify by today's genres, because they really aren't genre films. They're just films. They don't have a genre. Now, today we would slap epic or drama or true crime or we would try to find a genre label to give them, but Hollywood saw genre films as for kids or nerds, and your proper films as for everybody else, like the real people, quote, people, you know, the general audience, the mass audiences. Which is why this is the very reason why film historians and critics today try to argue that Alfred Hitchcock made horror movies, or at least made movies that would become the template for the horror genre later down the road. At the time he was making movies, he himself, Hollywood, and general audiences did not consider his movies horror movies. They considered them suspense movies, or thrillers, or just movies. They didn't really have genres. They didn't classify movie by genre back then, like we do today. Now, you also have to remember, comic books are older than you think. The comic books we think of, Justice League, Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Batman, etc., 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 most of those either came into existence or came into what we recognize them as today in the 60s. A handful, Superman, Batman, you know, Wonder Woman, and a few others, have their beginnings in the 30s and 40s. But what we think of today as comic books, you know, your superhero comics, your big sci-fi epics, that didn't start until the 60s. Back then, comic books followed the same form. This is important. You have to pay attention, because there's parallels that apply to what was happening culturally. You didn't buy a comic. You did not buy a Superman comic book and got 64 pages of Superman stories. That's not how comic books work. You bought an action comic that would have 64 pages of material. 24 pages would be a Superman story. The rest of it would be whatever the fuck they wanted it to be. Lone Ranger, World War II, you know, soldiers, Tarzan, or something like. It would just be whatever they wanted. Text, short stories, a single page of like one picture and a few paragraphs of, you know, here's the thing, like anecdote type stories, things like that. Batman was the same thing. He existed inside of an anthology series called Detective Comics. The Flash was the same thing. Flash Comics did not refer to the character, the Flash. It was just an umbrella for this comic included, quote, flashy stories, and one of the characters' stories contained within was the Flash. It was the same thing as when you went to the cinema. You had this hodgepodge of shit. Random shit. You didn't just go to the movies to watch a movie. You went to the movies. That's what you did for the day. Same thing. You didn't just buy a comic book and read about one character. You bought a comic book. That comic book was supposed to last you, you know, the whole week until the next issue came out of a different comic book. So, comic books did the same kind of thing. They would have the sci-fi superhero book story in the comic, but they would also have your, you know, your detective story, your crime film noir type story. They'd have your, you know, your western type story, your Tarzan type story, some type of creepy ghost story, some kind of comedy, you know, Blondie and Dagwood Three Stooges type story, etc. It would just be jam-packed with all kinds of content. As comic books and cinema would progress, a few things started to happen, again, simultaneously. One would affect the other. The first thing that happened was the creation of the Comics Code as a result of the backlash from, parents groups and other assholes that were saying comics were too violent. This started in the 50s and transformed, basically killed superhero and horror comics and left us with a whole bunch of rubbish we didn't care about for a whole good while. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, The Flash, Green Lantern continued, but they continued in a different form than what you were exposed to previously. Most of your Marvel comics, which again, same format, but I'm not going to go down the list because it's the same thing, Captain America, an actual publication called Marvel Comics, plus, Tales of Suspense, etc., etc. It was the same thing. But once the Comics Code came into existence, comic book publishers now had a set of guidelines they could follow to say, yeah, this comic book fits within the constrictions of the Comics Code. A little bit later than the Comics Code, but in response to what the cultural changes of the time, Hollywood introduced what we know today as the Motion Picture Association. Introduced as the MPAA, Motion Picture Association of America. They dropped the America, now it's just the MPA, but they do the same thing. They're the ones that slap a rating on a movie. Is it G for kids, PG for, not kids, or R for adults, or X for, adults. X did not mean triple X. It did not mean pornographic. It just meant too intense or violent or graphic or adult for kids or teenagers. So let's keep that in mind. Now, this is important. So, also happening in the 50s, we've entered the atomic age, where after World War II, we dropped the bombs, Russia dropped their bombs, and all of a sudden now we're in the, quote, atomic age. So there was this rush to create atomic scary movies, mutant monsters like Them, or The Blob, or The Day the Earth Stood Still, etc., etc. Based on this idea that the radioactive others, the scary, those out there, the communists, the aliens, the mutants, are coming to get you. This was paralleled in comics at the same time. Excuse me. So, then we get to the 50s. A big thing happens. Basically, the U.S. government tells the studios, you're no longer allowed to own direct distribution. You can't own the movie theaters anymore. They cut the companies in half. The movie theaters got to go be their own companies, and the studios got to be their own companies. So they could no longer book an entire day, an entire block of films. So what we used to refer to as a B movie, well, it didn't necessarily go away, but it was no longer the same. Now we're in the 60s. We're post-atomic age. Now we're into the hippie era, the free love movement, the counterculture, and now we're in the era of Vietnam. Gearing up for the Vietnam War and the space race. You would think, whereas the atomic age inspired sci-fi movies, the space age would have done the same thing, right? We're actually sending rockets with real astronauts to the moon now. We should be making movies to reflect this. Well, by and large, we weren't. And we weren't because of the counterculture. Kids didn't want, the teenagers who pay the bills when it comes to Hollywood, they didn't want to see those kind of movies. They wanted Easy Rider. They wanted The Graduate. They wanted, more realistic, more cynical kind of stuff. They didn't want flashy, scary, what we would say propaganda films is what they would have seen the sci-fi horror B-movies of the 50s as. Hey, join the military and go fight for your country to stop the Red Scare. These hippies weren't falling for that. They were like, fuck off, I don't want to go to Vietnam and come back in a casket. Fuck off. And also, because we were sending real astronauts to space, and society was more cynical, less optimistic, there was also this air of, we don't want movies that depict space travel unrealistically anymore, or unbelievably anymore. We want movies, and I'm saying we as in the culture of the time, want movies that are relevant to what's happening around us. So if you're going to do a space movie, you're going to do, Planet of the Apes or 2001: A Space Odyssey, a movie that captures the sensibilities of the time. Something that audiences can watch and say, yeah, I can see that happening. Because that's what they wanted. They didn't want The Day the Earth Stood Still. They didn't want Journey to the Center of the Earth. They didn't want The Time Machine anymore. It wasn't going to fly. So throughout the 60s, yes, horror movies, westerns, genre movies, sci-fi, those movies were still getting made, but the studios were no longer pushing them. Because previously they could say, alright, we'll make this sci-fi movie, and we'll slap it on a block. You'll go see, whatever the A-list movie is at the time, and then you might stay to see the sci-fi movie. Audiences weren't doing that in the 60s because they couldn't. Because the studio system got broken up. And so, and I'm oversimplifying, I'm leaving out a lot of details. What started to happen was kids who grew up in the 50s, little kids who grew up watching these sci-fi movies, they were teenagers in the 60s. They're going to be adults in the 70s. These kids, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, Francis Ford Coppola, Ridley Scott, James Cameron, they want to make movies. But they don't want to make the musicals, the big, you got to have all-star cast, Oscar performances. They didn't want to make those movies. They wanted to make genre films again. Now, you had some independent cinema. Tobe Hooper went out and did Texas Chainsaw Massacre. William Friedkin went out and did The Exorcist. Wes Craven and Sean Cunningham went out and did Last House on the Left. So you were starting to see the beginnings of independent cinema becoming a thing. Independent cinema didn't exist during the Hollywood system because you couldn't go make a movie as an independent filmmaker and show that movie in a Warner Brothers owned movie theater that was only going to show movies that were made by Warner Brothers. That wasn't happening. So you either had to find an independent movie house that was willing to show indie films, which there were not as many of them as you would have wanted there to be, or you had to take your B-movie, as we call it, your genre film, your horror film, your sci-fi film, and beg the studios to pick it up. Sometimes they did, in the case of like the previously mentioned, The Blob, Planet of the Apes, etc., etc. But a lot of times they didn't. They weren't interested. Now, the 70s we're in a new era. We're in the post-Vietnam era. We're in the quote apocalypse era. A lot of the genre movies of the 70s are post-apocalyptic or very dystopian. This is because people are like, hey, everybody I love was killed in Vietnam. What the fuck do I have to be optimistic about? I can't afford gas, can't get a job, can't buy a house. What the fuck? People were cynical all over again, only now they were extra cynical. Well, you can only be cynical for so long before you reach what we call the breaking point. And this started to happen in 1976. 75, 76. People always, whether it was during the Depression or the Atomic Age and the Korean War, the 60s and the Vietnam era, or the tumultuous 70s, or whatever. People always go to the cinema for specifically escapism. Now, what they want to see, what they want to escape into, has changed traditionally from one decade to the next. Now, I have to say traditionally because there's a turning point where everything changes. You know where I'm going with this. You know your film cinema. Your film history, I should say. But I'm going to give you the how we got there. So, now you've got The Exorcist out of the way, The Omen out of the way, Texas Chainsaw out of the way. You've already had Planet of the Apes and its never-ending parade of sequels. You've already had 2001: A Space Odyssey and its immediate sequels. But they didn't stick. They didn't enter the cultural zeitgeist. They just sort of happened. They had their little cult following, but they just sort of impacted, fans, genre fans, but general audiences, they were one and done. Okay, I saw Planet of the Apes, now I want to go see Smokey and the Bandit. General audiences weren't like, alright, I need to see more of this. They were just like, that was fun for 2 hours, now give me something else. And so it was like, the cinema films, as I call them, the films, which we would today call mixed, blended genres, mostly romantic, comedy, drama, epic, etc., etc. We try to contort them into modern genres, but they weren't genre films. They were just stories. They were films. They just existed. Now, yeah, you had kids' movies that were always a thing, and you still had musicals, and westerns were kind of sort of still a thing. Those were separate. Those were very specific genres. But those were fading away at this point. Even kids' movies weren't doing that great in the 70s. Disney was struggling in the 70s. And they were going to continue to struggle on into the 80s, but that's because of what happens next. I already talked about Steven Spielberg. He grew up on the sci-fi films of the 50s. Now he's old enough. He's out of film school. He wants to make movies. He wants to make sci-fi films, but Hollywood's like, we don't do that. Hollywood shut down their special effects departments. There were no special effects departments anymore because they weren't making films like Lawrence of Arabia or The Wizard of Oz anymore. Those movies were like decades old at this point. Decades old. That was long gone, done, past tense. Indie filmmakers were still doing special effects, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, etc., but they were doing it themselves. They weren't forming special effects departments. They were just hiring whoever they could get to do the makeup and the models and everything else. Steven Spielberg wanted to make a movie about a shark. He's like, it's a genre film. It's a horror film. It's got fantastical elements, It's got the action-adventure elements, the thriller elements, the comedy, the comic relief, and the family drama. He's like, let's make a film that's going to be a little more in the genre I want to make. Now, he has to make Jaws very specifically tailored to the sensibilities of the time, because that's what sells. Well, it's a monster movie at the end of the day. And Hollywood is like, nope, we're not interested. Well, he eventually talks his way into getting a budget and a production studio and a distributor on board. All right. He's got, I believe, Universal. And they're like, let's make this movie. Fine, let's do it. Here's your budget. Go make this little shark movie. Fine, whatever. We'll give you X amount of dollars. Go make your movie. You'll make your 2-3 times your budget back. We'll be happy. You'll be happy. And then you'll leave us alone and stop asking us to make this stupid shark movie. Well, something happened nobody predicted. Jaws was a summer film. It takes place over 4th of July weekend. So he releases it in the summer. Now, up to this point, your big releases that everybody's going to go see are released in time for Christmas. Your holiday releases, as they called them. Because that's when people go to the movies. In the summertime, they're going to the lake, they're going camping, they're going fishing and swimming and hiking. They're not watching movies. And it had been that way for the first 60, 70 years of Hollywood. That just was what people did. Video games didn't exist yet. Now, I glossed over the rise of superhero and sci-fi comics in the 60s, which would continue on into the 70s. And the reason why I glossed over that is because we're not talking about that. But I'm going to mention it now just to set the stage that people were starting to get hungry for sci-fi. They wanted X-Men, Fantastic Four, The Avengers, Iron Man. People wanted this stuff, but Hollywood wasn't ready yet. Now, Warner Brothers, looking at, some asshole in a board meeting or somewhere, looking through their list of shit we own, was like, hey, we own Superman. Why don't we make a Superman movie? But I have to come back to that. Because something else is going to happen first. Jaws releases, and before Jaws, your movie would get, if it was a big budget movie, quote, air quotes, big budget movie, it would get $20-30 million. Your big epics, Lawrence of Arabia, or your all-star cast movies, like Breakfast at Tiffany's or whatever. Not Easy Rider, but whatever. They'd get your all-star cast. They'd throw all their money behind the A-list actors and marketing and big set pieces, etc. And then your movie would make 70 to 80 million, which is, enough to pay the bills, and we made some money, and now let's move on. Occasionally, you'd get a movie like Gone with the Wind, or The Wizard of Oz, that they would keep releasing year after year, that would keep making more money year after year. They didn't have to do that as much in the 70s because they had television. They could just put their movies on television, people would watch them there, and they would get the syndication dollars, broadcast rights. But, movies would make money after the fact. Well, Jaws did something that was unprecedented. It had a modest budget, 20-30 million, somewhere in that ballpark. Maybe smaller, I don't know the exact budget. But it didn't make 3 or 4 or even 5 times its budget. It made so much money, it was astronomical. It was unbelievable. It was like, movies don't make that much money. That is not how you make... They do. Hollywood makes that money, but that's because they make the movie, they re-release it at 3 or 4 years, and then they put it out on TV every weekend, and then you just watch it that way. And then sometimes they make money off of, maybe toys or a spin-off or t-shirts or whatever. But that wasn't really a thing yet. Merchandise wasn't really a thing yet. But that's how they made their money. Well, Jaws made fucking boatloads of money. And Hollywood was like, wait a minute, movies don't make this much money. Especially genre movies. Especially horror movies. Especially monster movies. What the fuck happened? Hollywood didn't have an answer. they kind of wanted it to be a fluke. They wrote it off as a one-off, but they wanted those dollar bills. They were like, yeah, we'd like to make that much money again. What do we got to do it? Well, Steven Spielberg was like, all right, Jaws made boatloads of money. Can I make the movie I want to make now? And they're like, you got it, boss. And he went to make Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which is another sci-fi movie set in the 70s sensibilities. An alien spaceship comes to Earth, the military sets up base, scientists go investigate. It's a family drama dressed up as a sci-fi film. It's got some special effects, it's got a spaceship, but it's primarily a family drama set in a science fiction undertones. Up to this point, what we call science fiction had previously just been relegated to B movies. And so the science fiction of the time was stuff like 2001 or Planet of the Apes or whatever. Like I said, stuff that was more believable. Not necessarily more realistic, but believable to audiences at the time. Because fairy tales those were kids' movies. Alright. Close Encounters also made Titanic boatloads worth of money. And now Hollywood is like, maybe that wasn't a fluke? But they didn't see a pattern yet, because there really weren't any other big sci-fi movies in 75 or 76. The next big sci-fi movie was not intended to be a big blockbuster sci-fi movie. It was intended to be a low-budget, one-off B movie that kids and nerds would go see on a Saturday, and then we would sweep it under the rug and move on. That movie obviously is Star Wars. Well, long story short, because we're 38 minutes into this video, Star Wars changed everything instantly, permanently, overnight. Because now the studios couldn't say Close Encounters or Jaws was a fluke, a one-off. No. Star Wars is the real deal. Jaws made $500 million. Close Encounters made $400 million. Star Wars blew that out of the goddamn water. Star Wars made $1 billion. Not on box office tickets, but it made $1 billion its first year it was in theaters. Because it made its $800 million on ticket sales, which was way unprecedented for a sci-fi movie, a kids movie, a B movie. But also, it made buckets and buckets and buckets of money off of toys and lunch boxes and bed sheets and plushies and teddy bears and everything you could slap a Star Wars logo or picture on, got it. And it wasn't just kids, and it wasn't just nerds, and it wasn't just teenagers. Everybody on the fucking planet ate up Star Wars. All of a sudden, Hollywood stopped everything and said, whoa, what just fucking happened? What the fuck do we do? Let's make more of that. We want to make that kind of money from now on. That's how you make money. That's what we do. From now on, that's what we do. And so, now George Lucas can go to Hollywood and say, I want to make another Star Wars. And they're like, yo, how much do you need? Let's do it. Let's go. Let's get it going. Let's do it. We need it right now. We need it yesterday. And now Spielberg can say, I want to make another. I want to make a big budget movie. Give me $100 million. And they're like, here's the check. You fill in the amount you need, and then just come back with a finished product. And he goes on to make every fucking blockbuster you've ever seen. for the next 30 years. And then Ridley Scott is out here floating around. Hey, I'm trying to make a sci-fi movie. And Hollywood is like, no. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. No, 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 no. He's got this movie about an alien. The studio says, we'll make it, but you got to put the alien on a planet, and you got to ground it in reality, and you got to make it like, I don't know, the Forbidden Planet or something. You got to focus on the people and the characters. We don't want to see too much of the alien. We don't want to see spaceships at all. The studio's like, just tinkering with the movie, and he's like, that's not the movie I want to make. And then all of a sudden, Star Wars happens, and a shit-eating grin on his face, he goes back to the studio and says, I want to make that. And they're like, do it. Do it now. Get it done. And he goes and makes Alien. They just hand him the money, and all of a sudden, sci-fi movies are not the thing that we have to market to kids and nerds on Saturday morning, you know, after the grown-ups are back home taking a nap. No. Sci-fi movies, this is it. This is the it thing. This is what people want to see. If you want to make $1 billion at the blockbuster, at the box office, you know, ticket sales plus merchandise is how you make $1 billion now. It's got to be a genre film. A B movie. But we're not calling them B movies anymore. We're just taking the B and we're spelling it out blockbuster. Because now we have a new word that entered the vocabulary, the lexicon. Blockbuster. What's a blockbuster? A mega hit. A movie that makes 20, 30, 40 times its budget. Not 2 or 3 times its budget. Massive amounts of fucking money. Massive, massive amounts of money. Hey, Hollywood likes those goddamn dollar bills. Now, you still have auteurs and filmmakers that want to make, you know, Caddyshack and Animal House and Blues Brothers and yeah, sure. That people are not going to say no to that because the audiences will still go see a Blues Brothers or a Caddyshack in theaters. But you put an Animal House or a Revenge of the Nerds up against an E.T., an Indiana Jones, you put it up against an Aliens or a Back to the Future or Ghostbusters, that's all she wrote. Now people want genre films. And that's all they want. That is it. Your movie has to have, it can be a comedy, but it's got to have a twist. There needs to be a robot. Rocky IV. Realistic movie, got to have a robot. You know, you got to have a spaceship. You got to have an alien. You got to have a mutant. It just has to have something fantastical. Now, not every genre movie of the 80s was a mega hit. And there were the rise of independent studios coming about at the late 70s into the 80s, like Canon and New World and a few others. I'm not going to name them all. Troma, who were like, yeah, we want to make genre films, but we can do it on a low budget. And hey, now, if we can't get the movie in the cinema, it's okay. We'll put it on this little plastic piece, this little plastic cassette tape, and people will rent it, and we'll make our money that way. And a new industry was created. Home video. Well, in the late 70s, the word blockbuster was applied to one of the first premium cable networks, Home Box Office, shortened to HBO. And in the 80s, it would be slapped on the biggest video rental chain, Blockbuster Video. So now we have a concept of what is a blockbuster. It's basically the it movie that everybody has to see. Now, we have today, the word blockbuster would be applied to shit that aren't B movies or genre films like Titanic or Barbie. Oh, Barbie's in the ballpark. Oppenheimer, anything that makes 6 or more times its budget back. Basically, anything that makes 300 million up would be classified as a blockbuster. So today, what we used to call B movies in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, we now just call blockbusters, because today, from the 80s till today, that's what sells. In the 90s, what were your big blockbusters? Jurassic Park, Independence Day, Men in Black, The Mummy, The Matrix, Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. These were all sci-fi / horror / fantasy, quote, genre films. These were all B movies that just blew up. Well, because the 80s gave us direct-to-video movies, and it also gave us the low-budget independent genre film, we had to take the old term that we still had floating around in our brains, in our lexicon. Same reason why we still called CDs records or albums, even though today an album or a record is just a collection of digital songs on Spotify. We still use the word album, even though it goes way, 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 way back to when they were actual albums. But it's okay. We got this movie term in our lexicon, B movie. Even though by the accepted, established, original definition of B movie, Star Wars, Pirates of the Caribbean, Jurassic Park, The Matrix, those are B movies. By the traditional definition of a B movie, audiences today are like, no, B movie does not mean blockbuster. Those are blockbusters. B movie means low budget movie, genre film, horror, sci-fi, comedy, whatever. That's, not going to be a big success. Back to the Future would have been a B movie in the 60s and 70s. In the 80s, that's a blockbuster. Your B movie of the 80s would have been The Time Bandits. Your B movie of the 90s would have been Time Cop. Your blockbuster, Demolition Man. So now, studios not only have to give genre films a chance, they got to give them a budget, they got to give them special effects, they got to give them A-list actors. They got to put some money into these blockbusters, and they got to spend 50, 60, 100, 200, 300 million dollars to get one made so they can make that $1 billion back. Well, that's where we are. So today, we now use the term B movie to refer to low budget independent genre cinema versus just genre films in general, which is what the term originally meant. This is why legit good movies like Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles from 1990 are technically B movies, even though they were big hits, because they were low budget independent films. Well, not Friday the 13th, but that's another story. So now we have a new term that has co-opted a previous term. But because the B in B movie today is more often than not misapplied to, quote, bad movies, the ones people say are, quote, so bad it's good, or cult movies, movies that maybe didn't have an audience in their day but have found a following over the years, we now misapply the word B movie not as a category, but as a letter grade, a qualifier of quality. It's no longer a type of movie, it's a quality of the movie. So today, people say B movie, they think, yeah, that's just rubbish. You can like B movies, but you're not supposed to. Well, I got news for you. Star Wars, The Matrix, Terminator, Transformers, Dark of the Moon, Revenge of the Sith, those are B movies, whether you like it or not. Now, they're big case B blockbusters, but they're still lowercase b genre films. That is how we got from B movie to blockbuster.